In August 1919, one of the richest men who ever lived lay dying in a bedroom overlooking the Berkshire Mountains. His name was Andrew Carnegie. His fortune at its peak was equivalent to over $500 billion in today's money. More than the GDP of Sweden. More than the entire annual budget of the United States government. He had given away $350 million. He had built 2,509 libraries across the English-speaking world. Universities bore his name. Foundations in his name were still operating. His face appeared in newspapers, alongside words like philanthropist and visionary, and the greatest American of his era. His legacy was exactly what he had spent decades carefully constructing. And then, he whispered 4 sentences to his nurse, and everything collapsed. Not publicly, not in any newspaper, not in any official biography. Just in the private journal of a 44-year-old woman named Margaret Bower, who had no reason to lie and no incentive to damage a reputation she had spent 2 years watching its owner protect with extraordinary care. 4 sentences, recorded that evening in her private journal, hidden from public view for 47 years after his death. And when those 4 sentences finally surfaced, they explained something about Carnegie that his libraries and his foundations and his 2,000 carefully placed buildings never could. They explained what he actually thought he was doing, and they explained whether he believed at the end that it had worked. He said, "I did not give it all away. I kept enough to make sure they would remember me. I thought that mattered. It does not." This is the story of what Andrew Carnegie was actually building, and why the man who built it admitted on his deathbed that he had built the wrong thing. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland in 1835 into a family that was comfortable but not wealthy. His father, William, was a skilled master weaver. He owned his own loom. He made a decent living. The Carnegie family had food and security and dignity. And then the power loom arrived. Automated weaving technology that could produce fabric faster and cheaper than any human craftsman. Within 2 years, everything William Carnegie had built over decades of skilled labor was worthless. The machines had replaced him. The family went from comfortable to desperate, so fast it left marks on young Andrew that never healed. He was 11 years old when he watched his father beg for work that no longer existed. He watched his mother take in laundry to keep the family from starving. He watched a skilled craftsman be reduced to nothing by a technology he could not compete with. And he internalized a lesson in those years that would define everything he did for the rest of his life. The lesson was not about injustice. The lesson was about power. The people who controlled the machines won. The people who depended on their labor lost. Andrew Carnegie decided at 11 years old that he would never be on the losing side of that equation, no matter what it took, no matter who it cost. That decision made him the richest man in the world. It also made him the man who would spend the last years of his life awake at 3 in the morning, crying out for a business partner who had been dead for 2 years and reliving a battle that had happened a quarter century before. Because the lesson he learned at 11 was true. And the price of that truth was everything Margaret Bower recorded in her journal. The family immigrated to Pittsburgh in 1848. Carnegie was 12. His first job was as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill. 12-hour days at 12 years old for $1.20 per week. Then telegraph messenger. Then telegraph operator. Then personal assistant to Thomas Scott, a superintendent at the Pennsylvania Railroad. This is where Carnegie's real education began. Scott taught him how American business actually worked, not the version they teach in economics classes. The real version. How to manipulate stock prices. How to use insider information about land purchases before railroad routes were announced. How to structure deals so you profited, whether the company succeeded or failed. How to position yourself to benefit from other people's labor and capital and risk. Carnegie was a perfect student. By age 24, he was superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division. and he had already developed the habit of investing in the companies that supplied the railroad with the goods it needed, and then awarding those companies the railroad's contracts. Bridge company, sleeping car company, iron supplier. Carnegie was on every side of every deal simultaneously. The Civil War made him rich. While men his age were dying at Gettysburg and Antietam, and Shiloh, Carnegie stayed in Pennsylvania, managing railroads and selling the Union Army everything it needed at prices that turned his moderate savings into serious capital. He was 29 when the war ended, worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, and he had learned something important. The fastest way to accumulate wealth in capitalism is not innovation or superior products. It is market control. It is cutting costs to the absolute minimum. It is the willingness to destroy anyone who stands in your way. Carnegie looked at post-war America and understood something almost everyone else missed. The country was about to explode. Cities growing at rates nobody predicted. Immigration flooding the labor market with desperate workers. And all of it requiring one material more than any other: steel. Carnegie Steel was founded in 1873. The popular story says Carnegie succeeded because he was smarter, because he innovated faster, because he worked harder than his competitors. There is some truth there, but the real reason Carnegie Steel dominated American steel production had nothing to do with innovation. It had to do with ruthlessness. His strategy was simple: cut costs to the bone, produce steel cheaper than any competitor could match, undercut their prices until they went bankrupt, buy their assets at auction for pennies, consolidate control, repeat. To cut costs, Carnegie needed cheap labor. He found it in the waves of immigration flooding America in the 1880s and 1890s. Desperate men from Eastern Europe and Ireland and Italy. Men who spoke little English. Men who had no other options. Men who would work for wages that American-born workers would not accept. Carnegie's mills ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 12-hour shifts, and every 2 weeks when the shifts rotated, a worker would labor for 24 hours straight. Not a typo. 24 continuous hours in a steel mill where temperatures regularly exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit, where molten metal splashed, where machinery could tear off limbs in a fraction of a second, where a moment of exhaustion-induced inattention could mean death. The injury and death rates were staggering. In 1889 alone, Carnegie's plants officially reported 462 serious injuries, permanent disability, lost limbs, severe burns, crushed bones, death. That was the official number. The actual number was higher because minor injuries went unreported, and workers who complained were simply replaced. There was always another desperate man at the gates. Carnegie himself rarely visited his mills. He spent most of his time in New York or in Scotland at his estate. He insulated himself from the physical reality of how his fortune was being made. The workers were numbers in ledgers. The profits were reports sent to him by accountants. The dying was happening to people he would never meet. Then came 1892, the Homestead strike. This is the moment that should have ended Carnegie's reputation permanently. It should be the first thing anyone learns when they hear his name. Instead, it is barely a footnote in most histories. Carnegie's main plant was in Homestead, Pennsylvania. The workers were unionized. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was one of the strongest unions in America. Their contract was set to expire in June 1892. When negotiations for renewal began, the union's demands were modest: a slight wage increase to keep pace with exploding company profits, reduction of 12-hour shifts to 10 hours, basic safety improvements. Nothing that would threaten Carnegie Steel's profitability in any meaningful way. Carnegie refused everything. He decided to break the union entirely, to eliminate organized labor from his operations permanently. He put this plan in the hands of Henry Clay Frick, his partner and the company's chairman, a man known throughout American industry as one of the most viciously anti-labor executives in the country. Carnegie's instructions to Frick were explicit and have been documented in their preserved correspondence. Crush the Union. Do whatever it takes. I will back you completely. Frick built a 15-foot fence topped with barbed wire around the entire plant. Workers called it Fort Frick. He hired 300 Pinkerton agents, armed private mercenaries who specialized in violent strike-breaking. On July 6, 1892, the Pinkertons arrived by barge on the Monongahela River at 4 in the morning, hoping to enter the plant before the workers knew they were coming. But the workers had sentries posted along the river. They had been waiting. When the Pinkertons tried to land, the workers opened fire. What followed was an actual battle. 14 hours of armed combat on American soil between workers fighting for their union and a private army hired by the richest man in the country. 7 workers dead, 3 Pinkertons dead, dozens wounded. When it ended, the Pinkertons surrendered, and the workers controlled Homestead. They thought they had won. They had not understood the game being played. 4 days later, the governor of Pennsylvania sent 8,000 state militia troops to Homestead, not to investigate the company, not to mediate, to break the strike by force. The troops occupied the town. Replacement workers entered under armed guard. Strike leaders were arrested and charged with murder. The union collapsed within months. Carnegie Steel resumed operations with non-union workers at wages 20% lower than before. Production increased, profits increased, Carnegie became wealthier. Andrew Carnegie was in Scotland the entire time, at Skibo Castle, playing golf, entertaining guests. He would later claim in his autobiography that he had no knowledge of Frick's plans, that the violence horrified him when he heard about it, that he never would have approved it. This was a lie. The telegrams between Carnegie and Frick were preserved and surfaced decades later. Carnegie knew every detail of the plan. He approved it all. And when it was over and the union was broken, Carnegie sent Frick a telegram. Not a reprimand, a congratulation. Margaret Bower was 42 years old when she took the job as Carnegie's private nurse in 1917. She had trained at Massachusetts General Hospital. She took the Carnegie position because it paid well and because she believed the myth. The philanthropist, the man who gave away everything, the greatest benefactor of public education in American history. The Andrew Carnegie she actually met was 81 years old, physically frail, dying slowly of bronchial pneumonia. But his mind remained sharp, and as months passed and his condition worsened, something unexpected began happening. He started talking to her. Not the carefully rehearsed stories he told journalists and biographers, the real stories. Margaret kept a journal. She did not intend to publish it. It was just her way of processing what she was hearing. She wrote down conversations, his nightmares, the things he said when he thought no one important was listening. The journal stayed private until Margaret's death in 1972. Her daughter found it going through her mother's papers and donated it to the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh in 1966. The archivists who received it were stunned. It contradicted almost everything in the official biography. The library accepted the journal and classified it as restricted. They did not publicize its existence. Researchers who somehow learned of it often found their requests for access denied or indefinitely delayed. In an entry from March 1918, Margaret describes Carnegie waking from a nightmare at 3 in the morning, calling out for Henry Clay Frick. Frick had died 2 years earlier. He and Carnegie had not spoken since 1900, but in his delirium, Carnegie kept asking whether the Pinkertons had arrived yet, whether the strikers were still at the gates. He was reliving Homestead, more than 25 years later, still there in his mind, still playing out. In an entry from June 1918, Carnegie told Margaret about a letter he had received in 1893. The year after Homestead, it was from the widow of one of the workers killed in the battle. Her husband's name was John Morris. He was 34 years old, father of 4 children. His widow, Hannah Morris, wrote asking whether Carnegie would help pay for the funeral, whether he would provide any assistance for her and the children. Carnegie told Margaret he threw the letter away without responding. But 35 years later, lying in his bed dying, he told Margaret he remembered the letter, word for word. He remembered Hannah Morris's name. He remembered the ages of the 4 children. And he told Margaret that it bothered him that he had never responded. In multiple entries throughout 1918 and early 1919, Margaret describes Carnegie returning obsessively to a single question. He asked her repeatedly whether she thought his libraries made up for the workers who died, building his fortune. He did not want a comforting answer. He wanted her honest opinion. Margaret refused to offer easy comfort. She told him it was not her place to judge. But when he pressed, she told him that if he was asking the question, if he genuinely needed to ask whether the good balanced the bad, he probably already knew the answer. Now here is the part that the official Carnegie biography cannot absorb, cannot explain, cannot make fit the narrative that 2,500 libraries represent generosity rather than strategy. Carnegie published his essay, The Gospel of Wealth, in 1889. It became one of the most influential economic documents in American history. In it, he argued that dying rich was morally indefensible, that wealthy men had a duty to redistribute their fortunes strategically before they died. It made him famous in intellectual circles. It gave him a reputation as a philosopher of capitalism. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett cited Carnegie when they created the Giving Pledge. Mackenzie Scott structures her giving based on Carnegie's principles. The whole modern framework of billionaire philanthropy traces back to this essay. But when Carnegie published The Gospel of Wealth in 1889, he had not given away any significant amount of money. It was entirely theoretical. Philosophy without personal sacrifice. He did not actually start giving in earnest until 1901. He was 66 years old.
He had just sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for $480 million. Only then, only after extracting every possible dollar from his business, only after decades of the practices that killed John Morris and ignored Hannah Morris and her 4 children, only then did he start building libraries. And even then he kept $130 million. In today's money that is multiple billions. His charitable foundations were structured specifically to ensure his name would live in perpetuity. Carnegie Libraries required recipient cities to provide the land and commit to ongoing operational funding, which many small towns struggled to afford. This was not selfless giving. It was strategic. Carnegie was purchasing something with those donations. He was purchasing immortality. He was purchasing historical redemption. He was buying the right to be remembered as a philanthropist rather than as the man who hired the Pinkertons and threw away Hannah Morris's letter. And it worked. The Carnegie myth replaced the Carnegie reality within his own lifetime. The final entry in Margaret Bower's journal is dated August 11, 1919, the day Carnegie died. She describes his condition deteriorating throughout the morning, his breathing more labored, his periods of consciousness shorter. His wife Louise and his daughter were in the room most of the morning, but around 2 in the afternoon they stepped into the hallway briefly to speak with the doctor. That is when Carnegie opened his eyes. He looked directly at Margaret Bower. He gestured for her to come closer. She leaned next to his bed. His voice was barely a whisper. She had to put her ear close to his mouth to hear him. According to her journal, transcribed exactly as she wrote it that evening, he said 4 sentences. I did not give it all away. I kept enough to make sure they would remember me. I thought that mattered. It does not. Margaret did not respond. She did not know what to say. She held his hand. He closed his eyes. Within 20 minutes, he was dead. Those 4 sentences were never included in any official account of Carnegie's death. They are not engraved on any of the buildings bearing his name. They are not taught in business schools when professors discuss the gospel of wealth. But the nurse who was actually there, who had sat with him for 2 years, who had no reason to lie and nothing to gain from damaging his reputation, recorded something very different from the official story. A moment of clarity at the very end. A man who had spent decades constructing a legacy, admitting in the last conscious moments of his life that the entire construction had been motivated by ego, by the desire for immortality, and that on those terms he had failed. that the name on the buildings was not what he had actually wanted, that what he had actually wanted could not be purchased with libraries or foundations or $350 million carefully redistributed, that Hannah Morris's unanswered letter and John Morris's 4 children and the 47 years he spent trying not to think about Homestead were still there, still waiting, and that the Carnegie myth he had paid so much to create had not made a single one of those facts disappear. Margaret Bower lived until 1972. She gave exactly one interview after her journal became public in 1967. The interviewer asked her directly whether she thought Andrew Carnegie was a good man. She said she did not think good and bad were useful categories for someone like Carnegie, that he did both enormously good and enormously terrible things, both at a scale most people could not comprehend, that the question was not whether he was good or bad. The question was whether the good outweighed the terrible. And she said that only the people who actually suffered under his business practices had the right to answer that, not historians, not the people who used his libraries. Only the workers who died in his mills and the families they left behind. Those people cannot answer now. The workers who died at Homestead are long gone. Hannah Morris and her 4 children have no recorded history. They disappeared into obscurity, while Carnegie's name went on buildings that will stand for centuries. The Carnegie myth survives because people need it to survive. We need to believe that extreme wealth and moral goodness can coexist, that you can be a good billionaire if you give enough away before you die. Carnegie's legacy makes that belief possible, but Carnegie himself did not die believing it. The one person who heard his actual final words recorded a very different message, and that message, buried in a restricted archive for 47 years, might be the most honest thing Andrew Carnegie ever said. Not the gospel of wealth, not the 2,500 libraries, not the carefully crafted autobiography that erased Homestead and Hannah Morris and every unanswered letter. 4 sentences to a nurse who was holding his hand. I did not give it all away. I kept enough to make sure they would remember me. I thought that mattered. It does not.